All right, so I'm going to go over compositing an object into your scene in Blender. It's a little bit of a complex uh, project. You're going to have to build out a bunch of collections and render layers in order to render out certain things in your scene. I'm going to be separating things out into the base object, the shadow pass, and a reflective pass because of where I'm going to be compositing into. I need to have some reflections. So let's go ahead and get started on that. I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to add in a camera because I need a camera in my scene in order for this to work. I'm going to click on this little camera icon, take it there, and hello everybody. In this particular video, I'm going to be going over how to composite an object into a scene. So let's go ahead and get started on that. I'm going to hit Shift A, add a camera, and I'm going to go to my camera view. I have lock camera to view already selected, but if you ever need to find where that is, you hit N, you go all the way to view, and it is this little check mark right here where it says camera to view. So you can see it doesn't have that little red outline. With this checked, it has a little red outline. That means your camera is now locked to your particular view. So I'm going to zoom out, unlock this. I'm going to recenter this just a little bit, and now I'm going to lock camera to view again. So now what I need to do is I need to add in the image or the footage that I'm going to be using for my compositing. So since I'm just going to be doing a single image, I'm going to go into the camera settings, background images, add image. Now here you can add an image or a movie clip, but again, I'm only using an image, so I'm going to hit open. I'm going to find that picture. I'm going to be using this one right here on my desktop. Hit open. A little bit of a problem comes in here when you're trying to lay this stuff out properly. As you see, the framing method is set to stretch. I don't want that. I'm going to change this to crop. That way I can see the actual image and the image size and what it needs to be set to. So now I want to get my camera to be the same exact size as the image that I'm using. So I'm going to go up to my output properties, and I need to find the resolution that my image is at. The easiest way is to go and find your image, right click on it, go to properties, and you get this little properties tab. So I took this picture with my camera or my phone. I'm going to go to details, and now as you can see here, dimensions is 4096 by 3072, width and height. So all I have to do is punch in those numbers. 4096 by 3072. As you can see, my camera adjusted to fit the actual shape of my scene. So we've got that right. We've got everything going. Now let's go ahead and start laying in some objects so I can get this perspective set up properly. So what I have to do is I have to adjust the focal length of my camera to match the focal length of my scene. So this is really good if you're shooting your own footage or anything like that. You can easily find this information either on your camera settings or within the metadata that gets saved into the image. So right now, if I scroll down, I can find I used a 4mm lens focal length. So all I have to do is go 4mm. So I'm going to change this to 4. I like to just make these two match. I seem to get the best results out of that. So, okay. Now, since I don't have really anything to judge perspective in my scene on, I'm going to use these books over here in the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Shift A, add a mesh, and I'm going to add a cube. I'm going to hit G, Z, move it over here, and I'm going to go into wireframe mode. So I'm going to turn off lock camera to view. That way I can get in here and actually see what's going on. I'm going to grab this side face. I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to grab this top face. I'm going to pull it up so that this edge and this edge line up with the front edges of these books. Grab this back face and pull it back. And as you can see, if we click off of this, I already have the perspective pretty close. It's not quite 100%. So if I grab this face, pull it over a little bit more, you can see I'm a little bit off, but these books could also be leaning. That's why it's important that you have at least something in your scene to help you set up perspective, whether it's the horizon line or some other form of like grout lines or anything like that. This was a really close-up picture, so it's going to be a little difficult to set a perspective, but as you can see, I already got pretty close. So to get it to match 100%, or not 100%, but as close as possible, I'm going to click camera to view again. Oop. And I'm going to just do some very slight adjustments. That right there might have been exactly what I needed. Right there. So everything matches a little bit closer. It's a little bit better. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to select my camera, go to item, and I'm going to lock the positions and rotations of all of my objects. That way, or all of my camera rotations. That way, if I go into view and I have camera view locked, I can't scroll, I can't rotate, I can't zoom. This will stay where it's at. So, turn off camera to view. Now it's time to go into my render mode. I'm going to delete this box because I no longer need it. So now I've got my little box here. I can scale it up, scale it down, rotate it. Everything seems to be properly positioned. It looks relatively in the right scaling and the right orientation to my screen. So I can move this anywhere within the scene. I just have to be careful. Right now I'm going to leave it right here because I want to have my reflection here and a cast shadow here. So, for next thing I need to do, I need to create an object that is going to catch my reflections and is going to catch my shadows. So I'm going to hit Shift A and add a plane, just a simple plane. Scale this up, move this over. I'm going to have it fit pretty close within my scene, like this. I'm going to move this down. I'm going to leave my camera angle real quick. That way I can take a look at my scene, get this as close to the bottom as possible. I could check a view like this. It's pretty close. I'd say that's just about perfect. All right. So next thing I need to do, I need to add some lights. So I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to add a light. I'm going to add two lights. I'm going to add a sunlight. That way I can get lighting the overall angle of my light. So I'm going to pull this up and then I'm going to move this over here. I don't have to technically, but I want to. I'm going to hit Shift T. And now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to match the direction of the shadows in my reference layer. So if I go to like wireframe mode, you can see, in fact, I'm going to click on my camera and I'm going to change this opacity to 100%. That way we can see what's going on here. So I'm trying to get my shadows to match these shadows right here. So now if I go to render view, I'm looking to make sure that my shadows are at least in the same direction. Oops, I don't want to move you. I want to move the light. So now I'd say that looks pretty good right here. I'm going to rotate this object to be, I'd say that's fine. I'm gonna move this back just a little bit. Say that's good. I'm gonna pull this up a bit more. Now I'm gonna pull this back. And I'm gonna turn up the brightness. Because what I need to do, if I hide this, I need to make this look very similar to the lighting within here. So I need this to be a little bit brighter. I'd say right there's pretty close to what I need. And now I'm going to turn my plane back on. Now what I need to do is I need to give this plane a material, because right now you can't really see, all it's doing is catching shadows, but I need it to reflect and reflect the same color of light in my scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new material, and I'm going to call this plane. So base color, I'm just going to grab an eyedropper and I'm going to pick just a flat color, just so it generally looks like the same color of my what I'm trying to match here. I'm going to up the specular. I'm going to lower the roughness. And here's another thing. I need to be working in cycles. Right now I have my settings set to Eevee. So if I go to cycles, now you can actually start to see the reflections and the light and the shadow and all that other good stuff. So right now my shadows are a little harsh. And this is why I'm using a sunlight to begin with, because I can soften out my shadows. I'm going to increase the angle. And I'm going to say that's good, because it softened this up to a pretty close approximation of the rest of these. Now what I need to do is I need to decrease the density of the shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a simple ambient light or point light. Hit G, Z, Shift Z, and I'm going to move it over here. As you can see, it's starting to show up. I'm going to change its color to match this. And I'm going to increase the radius to a really large size. That way it covers most of this. And I'm going to turn off cast shadows. I'm going to bump up the power. I'm going to bump it up really high. I'm going to put it to like 5,000. As you can see, it's starting to change the color, but it's not changing the color in the actual shadow. You can see it in the reflection. I need to make sure that this light does not show up in any of my reflections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on with my light selected, I'm going to go to visibility, and I'm going to turn off glossy. So now, if I zoom in, you cannot see it appearing in there. If I turn off diffuse, it removes the light entirely. But I want to have it, so there it is. Now what I need to do is need to grab this light, and I'm just going to bump up the value just a bit until I get comfortable with the color of my shadow. Move this around, maybe pick this up just a bit. I'm going to turn on shadow caustics. I'm going to turn down the brightness just a bit. I can increase the angle of my sun as well, just to make this a little bit softer. Thing about this is if I make my shadows too soft, I'm going to have to increase the scale of this so that I can capture all the shadow detail that I'm going to need for my scene. So I'm going to say this is pretty good. All right. So now what I'm going to do, you're going to need to start moving things into different collections. So I'm going to hit M to create a new collection. I'm going to call this one Plane. Actually, I'm going to call this one Shadows. Call this Shadow. This I'm going to move into a new collection as well and call this Cartridge. And here's something else that you're going to need to do. You need to duplicate this plane object. So I'm going to hit Shift D, create a duplicate. I'm going to right click so that it stays on the same area. I'm going to hit M, new collection, and I'm going to call this one Reflections. So this is important. I'm going to, if you come over here, you can see this exclude from view layer. That means if you check this, it will not appear in any of the scenes. So if I click on this, my cartridge will disappear and it won't appear in any of my renders. But for now, I want to keep this one. This is where things are going to start getting complicated. We're going to start working in view layers and we're going to start setting up render passes and everything else. So get prepared. This is where things get a little nuts. I'm going to open up over here. You're going to see this little tool right here, filter. Make sure you turn on this indirect only. That way you get this little bounced arrow thing. This is going to be useful when you set up this first render layer. Okay, so this render layer I'm going to call base. Up here is your render layers. If you click on this drop down, you get a bunch of render layers. If you come over here, this is where you're going to create a new render layer. It's going to call it base 001. This one I'm going to call shadow. I'm going to create another one. I'm going to need 3 render layers. And I'm going to call this one reflections. So, to avoid getting overly complicated, this is just going to be my base color. It's not going to have any shadows. It's not going to have any reflections. It's just going to be the light setup that I have and my cartridge. My shadow pass is going to be just my shadow layer. So all you're going to see is shadows. And for the reflections, all you're going to see is this bit right here when we render. So I'm going to go to my base and I want this to render out with the color that is being bounced off from this object, but I don't want to see the shadows or anything like that. So what I need to do is I need to, on the shadow, I'm going to turn on the indirect only. As you can see, it disappears. Now, if I go ahead and render this, you're going to notice something, that this scene is going to be a solid gray object. So what I need to do is I'm going to go to my background. I'm going to turn off my background lights. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to my render settings, change this to GPU compute. That way it renders faster and it's not so hard on your computer. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to open up film and I'm going to turn on transparent. So now, as you can see, I've got this checker background going on. That means I will have alpha information when I render out this image. So that means this will all be transparent while this is the only solid piece. So I now have my base set up. As you can see, I've got some brown being reflected from the plane and I don't have any shadows and I don't have any reflections. So now what I need to do, I'm going to go to my shadows. This is where things are going to get interesting. I'm going to click on this. I'm going to go to my object properties. Make sure you're on the shadow plane because right now it's so dark because I've got 2. I'm going to turn off my reflections again, exclude from view layer. That way I get back to this. go to your shadow plane. You're going to go over to your object properties. You're going to scroll down to visibility and you're going to turn on shadow catcher. So now as you can see, you have your shadows, but you also have transparency. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to turn my cartridge into indirect only. Now I have my shadows. So that's my shadow layer all set up. I'm going to go to reflections. This one's a little tricky. I'm going to turn off I'm going to exclude from layer the shadow plane. And for my reflections, I'm going to set my cartridge to be indirect only. And now what I need to do is I'm going to set up a render pass for this scene only. So what I'm going to do is to get to your render passes, you need to come over here to view layer properties, and these are going to be your render passes. The only one I'm interested in is the glossy indirect. And the way that you check to make sure that the glossy indirect is working is you can come up here to this little drop down. You see where it says render pass? You can click on glossy indirect, and this is all the information that is going to be rendered out in the glossy indirect. This is what we want. This is what we're going for. Now, if you look at this scene and you think you need to make this a little bit more broken up, you can always go to your material and increase the roughness, which is what I think I'm going to do by a relatively high amount. I'm going to say that's pretty good right there. So this is what's going to get rendered out in my scene that will be overlaid later when I go to composite in Photoshop. So, are we ready to render? Not quite yet. Like I said, this is going to take a little bit of time and it's a little complicated. So if I go to my shadow, I'm going to change this back to combined. So there's my shadow, there's my base, and here's my reflections. Oh, one more thing about this reflections. If you come over here to your render passes again, you can turn off the combined. That way you'll only get the indirect in your final render. Now, this is where we're going to have to move into another tab of Blender, the Compositing tab. So let's go to the Compositing tab and let's hit Use Nodes. So I've got my composite node, do not delete this, and I've got my render layers. As you can see, if I come over here, I have base, shadow, and reflections. So I need to have one of these for each one of those layers. So I'm going to hit Shift D and Shift D. So now that I've got 3 render layers, this one's going to be my base, this one is going to be my shadow, and this one is going to be my reflections. So as you can see, I've got my glossy indirect here, and I've got my regular images up here. So here's what you do. If I go ahead and hit render, I'm going to render my images out. I'll be right back with you when this is done. All right, so now that we're done, we can come over here. We can open the composite. We can see our base layers, our shadow passes, and our reflections. So right now it's coming out as combined. So if I hit glossy indirect, this is actually what's being indirectly added. This will be added into my scene through a screen layer. If I go to shadows, I just get my basic shadows. And if I go to base, I just get my base, which is exactly what I need. So I'm going to close this. Now, if I come over here, if I have Node Wrangler enabled, I hit Control, Shift, and click. I get a viewer node, which will actually show me what is in my scene. So if I click on this, if I click on the glossy indirect, that is what I get. Cool. So here's what we're going to do. We could save each one of these files out individually if we wanted to, Or if we had done some early legwork, what we could do is we could add a file output node. So type in Shift A, hit File, and look for File Output, and drop it in here. So as you can see, we've got a node with one other node attached to it, or one input. So I can click and drag this and put this here, but if I try to click and drag this and put it in here, it replaces this one. So what I'm going to do, click and drag this. I'm going to click on the File Output node, come over here to the right, click on Node, open up the properties, and now, as you can see, is where I get all the information on this node. Right now, I have only one image, and this one I'm going to call base. I'm going to add an input, and as you can see, as I added an input, put it in right there. I'm going to call this one shadow. So now if I grab this and plug it into the shadow, that's going to be my shadow image that it's going to save out when I finally put a base path to it. I'm going to add another input, and I'm going to call this one gloss ind for indirect. And I'm going to grab the gloss ind and plug it into there. So when I go over here, I'm going to go to the base path, and now I can save this wherever I need it to. I'm going to save it to my desktop, and I'm just going to say comp2, and I'm going to hit accept. So if I hit accept like that, all it's going to do is it's going to create a folder when I go to render it out. So go over here, hit render, render image, and it's going to render out your images once more. All right, so we finally finished our render, and you have to re-render in order for that to work. So now if you come up here, look around, comp2, as you can see, it rendered out each image in its own layer. And don't worry about this being black, because what we're going to do is we're going to add it to a screen, and the black will not affect the screen color. So, say that's all done, let's go ahead and open up Photoshop. As you can see, I already have the image brought in here. All I have to do now is I have to place these in the right order. I'm going to open up my File Explorer, go to Desktop, open up Comp2. So, first things first, shadows. Hit check. Now I need to come over here. I'm going to drop in the base. Hit check. As you can see, it's coming in just fine. And now, if I come over here, I'm going to drop in the gloss. So the gloss kind of overrides everything until I go to normal and change this to screen. The way to get the best out of this, that way you're not seeing any, like this little bit right here. I don't know if you can see that, but if I zoom in, you can see this little part here appearing. All you have to do is put that under the shadow. You can put it under the base, or you could even put it under the shadow, and it will disappear. So there we go. It's underneath the shadow. If it was above the shadow, doesn't really do too much, but being underneath the shadow, it seems to work out a little bit better. So I turn on the base. Now the cool thing about this being composited, now I can come over here and I can actually start messing with certain portions of this. So right now I've got my shadow set to normal. I could set this to an overlay. I could change the layer typing. I could even change the opacity, so I can turn the opacity down just a bit. That way it fits the scene a little bit better, so it's not quite so dark. And there we go. So that's how you do a simple composite in Blender and move it out into Photoshop to do the actual compositing. Let me know what you guys think, and I will see you in the next video.